to introduce and discuss critical aspects of Southeast Asian nations and their economic and strategic significance. A huge thank you to Danny Menda from Congressman Joaquin Castro's office and Rachel Wagley from Congresswoman Ann Wagner's office for their committed support in helping us organize this series. I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Mr. Geoffrey Hartman, who is fellow with the Southeast Asia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Before joining CSIS, he served as a foreign affairs specialist in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, working on shaping U.S. defense policy in Southeast Asia. We're delighted that he could join us here today. I'll turn it over to him and have him introduce our keynote speaker and moderate the panel. Thank you, Jeff.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I guess I'll be introducing Brian Harding. Ryan's the Director for East and Southeast Asia for the National Security and International Policy Team at the Center for American Progress. And so in that role, he manages a wide range of projects focused on U.S. foreign policy in the Asia Pacific. Before he joined CAP, he had the same job as me. OSD policy, working as a country director in the Southeast Asia office of OSD policy. And he managed U.S. defense relations with key Southeast Asian partners of Indonesia and Singapore, and also advised senior DoD leadership on Asia Pacific regional strategy. Some of his kind of key achievements was the creation of a role in several high-profile defense policy initiatives, most notably the deployment of U.S. Marines to Darwin in Northern Australia, and also patrol combat ships to Singapore. Prior to being at DoD, he was a research associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I learned how. And was actually one of the first members of the Southeast Asia program at CSIS, which was the first Southeast Asia focused think tank program in DC. So I want to thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for being here. Before that, he also worked at the Eurasia Group and Moderator 360, and he has a master's degree from the Elliott School, George Washington, and a BA in history from Middlebury. So.
Thanks, Jeff, and thank you for your patience. It's great to see everybody stayed in the room, and truly extraordinary that this many people on Capitol Hill are in the room to talk about Southeast Asian policy, and that's a fantastic thing. The first thing I would say before I even get into the substance, so I come from the Center for American Progress. I think, as everyone knows, this could be a highly political entity. I think I may literally have the least political job in our entire building, working on Asia policy, and specifically Southeast Asian policy. I have incredible respect for friends across the aisle, including Walter Lohman at the Heritage Foundation, who I think if he had anything different to say than I have to say, that's just a personal matter, because Walter's smarter than I am. This is truly a non-partisan area of study, and I just do happen to spend my days at the Center for American Progress, where others are doing far more political things. It is, in my about 13 years, since about 2004, working on Southeast Asia issues in Washington, D.C., it's been really heartening to see a real swell of interest in the region. I mean, it would be unthinkable that the number of people that are in the room right now would have been in this room, I think, in 2004. And the creation of the Congressional Caucus is a fantastic thing. When I helped start the Southeast Asia Studies program at CSIS in 2007, there were no Southeast Asia Studies programs in any of the DC think tanks. Now I think everybody's at least dabbling in it a little bit, and CSIS has really become a really important hub for dialogue and education on the region. And if you have any interest in Southeast Asia, I'd say sign up for our stuff, but definitely sign up for Jeff's program stuff, because they're really doing really important work for shining light on the region here in Washington. I understand that this is the third installment of this series, and following Ambassador Roy and Ernie Bauer is a tall task. I've been asked to talk about the strategic importance of the ASEAN partnership today. I'm sure not everybody who's here attended those last two discussions, so after I'm done, I think everything is fair game. If you want to talk about the history of ASEAN that Ambassador Roy talked about, or the politics and economics of any particular country, you want to talk Indonesian politics, I'm sure Jeff and I can entertain those questions. So first, the bottom line up front. Asia is very important and complicated as far as I'm concerned, and ASEAN is a somewhat effective institution, but it's the only game in town. It's the only viable hub around which a regional political security architecture can be formed. And if the United States cares about engagement with Asia, it needs to care about its strategic relationship with ASEAN. So I'm going to go through and try to answer in a little shorter amount of time just 4 key questions. One is just from the basics. What is ASEAN today? How does it work? Why is ASEAN important in the broader international relations of Asia? How does the United States work with ASEAN? And then maybe a few thoughts at the end on why it's strategically important for the United States to work with it. So at the top, just in terms of definitions about what is ASEAN, and this is somewhat debatable, but in my mind there's a difference between Southeast Asia and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. To me, ASEAN is an organization that comprises the 10 countries of Southeast Asia. And the international relations of ASEAN are not the entirety of international relations of Southeast Asia. Indonesia and Malaysia have a very important distinctive relationship outside of the ASEAN context, for instance. The United States, while it engages ASEAN, and I'll get into that in a little bit, also has rich bilateral relationships with all the countries in the region. So for the purpose of today, I'll consider ASEAN to be an organization. Now, if you went out there to Jakarta, where the headquarters of the ASEAN, the association, is located, and asked them what it is, they would tell you that they are a, quote, community. They are the ASEAN community that was established in 2015. They would tell you that there are 3 pillars of their community: an economic community where goods, services, labor move freely around the region, across borders. They would tell you that they have a political security pillar, a political security community, in which the members resolve disputes peacefully, and they try to build peace with one another. And they would tell you that they have a socio-cultural community, a socio-cultural pillar that is trying to build an ASEAN identity. In reality, though, ASEAN is really, I'd say, an intergovernmental organization that brings together officials for a myriad of meetings on a myriad of different topics. But it does have structure. It has a charter, which is akin to a constitution. It was adopted in 2007, ratified by parliaments around the region. It has a secretariat, which is based in Jakarta. It has a secretary general, it has a staff. But where this might differ, where it very clearly differs from organizations that some of us might be more familiar with, like the European Union, the secretariat in Jakarta is incredibly small. It has a budget of $20 million. It has 3 deputy secretary generals, and those people probably have 3 staffers working for them. Each ASEAN country, each of the 10 countries, has a permanent representative sent to Jakarta to represent their country on this Council of Permanent Representatives, but they're not empowered. Really, power lies back in the capitals, which means that the Secretariat is not a high-functioning entity. I mean, you certainly don't have people around Southeast Asia complaining about bureaucrats in Jakarta the way you might have Europeans complaining about bureaucrats in Brussels. The power is just not there. It's not integrated in that way. Instead, one of the key aspects is that you have, instead of having power located in Jakarta, you have power that rotates annually. So every year there's one of the 10 countries within ASEAN is the chair of ASEAN. This year it's the Philippines. That country hosts all of the ministerial meetings. They set the priorities, they write the agendas, they set the themes for the year. And so priorities and energy can shift dramatically from year to year. From a year in which Laos is the chair, which has incredibly little institutional capacity, to a country like Singapore, which is really looking to drive the agenda. The Philippines is a pretty interesting year right now with President Duterte. We can talk more about that. And the last thing I'd say, just structurally on ASEAN, it's important to note that this is a very congenial, consensus-driven entity. This is not somewhere where a country tables an idea, you vote on it 6-4, and this is the direction we go. Everything is consensus, decision-making based, which means, at its worst, you have a lowest common denominator type approach to various issues. So, moving on, why is ASEAN important to the international relations of the broader Asia-Pacific region? On this account, I'd say ASEAN has been pretty remarkably successful, managed quite a feat, in that its internal cohesion and its drive has really put it at the center of broader regional architecture. This started with developing 10+1 arrangements with major outside partners. So today, ASEAN has 10, quote, dialogue partners that they meet with on a regular basis, usually at the head of state level. So in ASEAN plus China, ASEAN plus Japan, United States, India, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and even Canada and the European Union. There are a total of 10 of them. In 1994, ASEAN also created something called the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is a venue for Asia-Pacific foreign ministers to gather and talk about political security issues. This still remains the one multilateral meeting in Asia that the US Secretary of State travels and attends on an annual basis. We can talk about the ARF and its shortcomings perhaps later on. ASEAN also created the East Asia Summit in 2005 that got expanded outward to include the United States in 2009 or 10. I have to go back to my notes. It also created the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus in 2010, which is the one venue that brings together the major Asia-Pacific defense ministers in the region. And while these are all multilateral meetings, they're all, it's important to note, these are all actually ASEAN meetings. The agenda, they take place in the country that is hosting joining ASEAN. That country, in this case, in this year the Philippines, that country will set the agenda, has the pen on the communique. These are, at the end of the day, while the United States, Japan, China, and others are there, these are ASEAN meetings. And I think it's pretty remarkable that instead of the Asia-Pacific regional bodies being dominated and being driven by the biggest countries in the region, China, Japan, India, the United States, ASEAN really is, it's again, all debatable and very esoteric when we get into Southeast Asia community discussions, but at the end of the day, Southeast Asia is in the driver's seat here and is central to the regional security agenda. All that said, because of this, this disparate membership and everybody prioritizing getting along over a lot of other things, these organizations are also, just to be very clear, not incredibly highly performing. They're not solving the biggest problems of the day. And I would say that one of the built-in weaknesses of these entities, these ASEAN-based institutions, is their organizational basis themselves, which is ASEAN. And while ASEAN plays the lead role in setting the agendas for these organizations, protocol, as I discussed, the so-called ASEAN way, requiring collective decision-making, and ASEAN consensus makes working on difficult issues, such as the South China Sea, incredibly difficult. So the paradox here is that the arrangement sort of works precisely because it removes what would be contentious questions, but at the same time it sort of destines the entity to sort of be a middling in terms of performance. Of course, outside partners also have mixed priorities, so we don't make it easy on them. The United States comes in hard in these organizations and says we want to work on hard security issues. China says let's talk about development issues. South Korea says let's just talk about North Korea. So you have these competing demands, and it results in, I would say, underperformance. So, trying to accelerate here a little bit. So in terms of U.S. engagement with ASEAN as an organization, and again, I'm very happy in the Q&A to talk about U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia more broadly. But in terms of U.S. engagement with ASEAN, which is by nature multilateral engagement with ASEAN, we engage quite a lot these days, but that hasn't long been the case. The United States, though, did become a dialogue partner with ASEAN, along with those other 10, in 1977, but I would say that deeper ties with ASEAN really only began around 2007 and really accelerated starting around 2009. I would mark 2007, perhaps this is because of personal experience and helping to start up the CSI Southeast Asia program in 2007. It was really a moment where I think Washington started to get the memo that it was supposed to pay attention to Southeast Asia for the first time since the end of the Vietnam War era in 1975. And right around this time, I think there were some really important course corrections in the Bush administration's approach to Asia, which included some deeper engagement with ASEAN, which was really, really smart. The first key thing that happened was in 2008 nominating a US ambassador to ASEAN. Of course, we have ambassadors in each of the 10 countries, but the United States did not have an ambassador to ASEAN. Actually, nobody had an ambassador to ASEAN. So in 2008, the gentleman, Scott Marziel, who's now our ambassador in Burma, when he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Southeast Asia, he got dual-hatted as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Southeast Asia and also the US Ambassador to ASEAN. It was a nice gesture. Things, in my mind, really began to accelerate in 2009 under the Obama administration. I think this was in line with two overarching priorities for the administration. One being ramping up multilateral engagement globally, and two, paying more attention to Asia. You take those two things, you're going to have a deeper US-ASEAN partnership. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton very clearly signaled this on her first trip abroad as Secretary of State. A lot of people will remember that on her first trip as Secretary, she went to Asia. This was a real break. First Secretary of State since Dean Rusk 50 years earlier to travel to Asia. As her first trip as Secretary. She went to Japan, Korea, China. She also went to Indonesia, not just because Indonesia is the most important, biggest country in Southeast Asia, but because she wanted to visit the ASEAN Secretary. And that's actually something that no Secretary of State had ever done. And the signal here, very clearly, was we're going to pay more attention to ASEAN as an institution, multilateral engagement with Southeast Asia. In 2009, the Obama administration also signed ASEAN's Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. This is, of course, with many riders on it, but it's something that ASEAN had wanted us to do for a long time, and it had become a requirement for membership in the East Asia Summit. The East Asia Summit, which had started with ASEAN plus 6, Japan, Korea, China, Australia, New Zealand, and India, was something that the United States was initially curious about, but not particularly interested in signing up for another talk show, which these forums had often been derided by previous administrations. But the Obama administration, for better or worse, said, I want to go to all these talk shops in Asia. We want to be a member of the East Asia Summit. So they needed to sign the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. They did, which opened up membership into the East Asia Summit. Just a footnote, for the East Asia Summit countries and ASEAN to welcome the United States, they also had to bring in Russia as something of a balance for essentially for China to be supportive of the United States coming into this forum as well to balance things out. From my personal viewpoint, in 2009, I went over to the Southeast Asia Policy Office of the Pentagon, the place where Jeff and I worked. The Southeast Asia Policy Office had been very clearly a backwater before I got there, and all of a sudden there was a lot of attention from the senior leadership, including Secretary of Defense Bob Gates at the time, and there was no ASEAN dedicated desk officer. It was a very small bureaucratic thing. There weren't a lot of ASEAN desk officers around the US government, and all of a sudden they started cropping up as the United States engaged more deeply with all these senior level forums and those structures that supported them. The Obama administration, President Obama attended all but one of the East Asia summits that he should have. The one was because of the government shutdown in 2014, I guess. The Secretary of State attended the ASEAN Regional Forum every year. President Obama hosted 10 ASEAN leaders at a special summit at Sunnylands that the ASEAN leaders still call high watermark in the relationship. And the administration very clearly kept talking about the importance of ASEAN centrality. So no matter who had been elected last November, the bar was going to be really, really high for how you continue this momentum with ASEAN as far as I'm concerned. And a lot of the low-hanging fruit had already been harvested. We signed up for all the big meetings, we attended all the big meetings, what was going to be the next thing? If I could just a couple observations on the Trump administration's engagement with ASEAN. One thing that's been heartening is that they've pretty clearly gotten the memo that they're supposed to pay attention to ASEAN. And President Trump personally and Secretary Tillerson personally have experience in Southeast Asia. I'm sure Secretary Tillerson was aware generally of ASEAN as a structure before he took on the position. And within his first 2 or 3 weeks, he hosted the 10 ASEAN ambassadors at the State Department for a multilateral 10+1 meeting. This seems like a normal, smart thing to do, but it's actually something no Secretary of State had ever done. Hosted the 10 ASEAN ambassadors for a meeting, signaling the importance of ASEAN. This is a really good thing. He also invited the 10 ASEAN foreign ministers to come to Washington. Excellent. Another great thing. Vice President Pence, on his first trip out to Asia, dropped into Jakarta, went to the ASEAN Secretariat. Again, fantastic. So I'm quite encouraged that they recognize that this is an important entity and an important region. The concerns I have based on my conversations with friends from these 10 countries is that they're still waiting for the policy. They say, what's ASEAN policy? Okay, this is nice that we've had some meetings. You've told us in these meetings about how we need to get tougher on North Korea. Okay, that's important to do. But what's the ASEAN policy? You haven't told us yet why ASEAN is important, because ASEAN and Southeast Asia are important. So there's still time here. President Trump has said he's going to travel to Manila for the East Asia Summit later this year. Secretary Tillerson will head out for the ASEAN Regional Forum this summer in Manila as well. Those are big opportunities to lay out a vision for U.S.-ASEAN engagement, and I personally really hope to see that. And the last thing I noted before, just a couple of points on why it's important to keep doing this, is that, just to come back to it, and again, happy to talk about this in the Q&A, but U.S.-ASEAN relationship, this multilateral engagement, is far from the only form of U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia. At the end of the day, in many of these bilateral relationships, especially the most productive ones, like U.S.-Singapore, U.S.-Vietnam, to some extent U.S.-Philippines and Thailand are 2 allies, you're going to get more business done in the bilateral setting. So I think what you have is, and this is certainly what you had 6 months ago, I think it's what's continuing, is really a 2-track U.S. approach to Southeast Asia. It's work with ASEAN where you can, build it into an entity that we can do things with, but at the same time, continue your deep bilateral engagement with individual countries to achieve aims that you really need to do in the region. So finally, I was asked to speak about why the U.S.-ASEAN relation is important, and why we should spend all this time and effort engaging with this underperforming, very frustrating organization. And I came up with 3 quick ones. Number 1, it's the only game in town. ASEAN is central to the region's emerging regional security architecture, and there are no other alternatives. Regionalism just can't work by being driven by the major powers. The United States cannot just be the clear driver of regionalism in Asia Pacific. Neither can China, neither can Japan. There needs to be this coalition of smaller countries to bring together the big powers. Number 2, investing in ASEAN pays off for U.S. bilateral relations with the countries in ASEAN that we care about. All of the Southeast Asian countries are deeply invested in ASEAN. If you don't show that investment in ASEAN, you're going to struggle in your U.S.-Indonesia relationship, you're going to struggle in your U.S.-Malaysia relationship, etc. And finally, while underperforming and frustrating at times, if you just take a look at the ASEAN Charter and everything that they sign up to regularly in communiques and summits, there's not a whole lot of moral ambiguity here. We stand for what ASEAN stands for. A rules-based order, openness, tolerance, focusing on key transnational issues, climate issues, environment, you name it. So this is a natural partner focusing on the issues that we care about here. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. I guess I'll use my privilege as a moderator to ask one question first, and I'll open it up. So maybe just raise hands because I want to call people. So I think you kind of identified one of the key paradoxes of ASEAN, which is that on the one hand it's central to the regional architecture and also all diplomatic efforts in the region, but it also has a not we have warned the reputation as an intellectual option.
Yep,
So,
it's all true.
well, you and I have been doing this long enough that every time a meeting's come around, we have the results out in the press, we can generally tell whether that was a good meeting, like that was a positive, or ASEAN did a lot for ASEAN at that time,
Yeah.
or whether they didn't. For a non-expert, it's not so obvious. So what if you just briefly describe, like, especially on key challenges like the South China Sea area, if people are looking at the press after the ARF issue or the EAS, what should they look for to say, like, oh, ASEAN did a good job on day 3 this year, and just what does progress look like for a non-expert?
Yeah, well, you know, one thing I'd come back to is the fact that ASEAN is really a collection of 10 countries as opposed to being one cohesive organization. And with the key point that ASEAN chairs rotate among the various countries each year. So I think when we have these kinds of conversations about did they have a good summit, a lot of it is graded on a curve about who is chairing ASEAN. When Singapore is chairing ASEAN, like they're going to chair next year, they have very high expectations for where they can drive things. This year, with a very erratic Philippines government, I wouldn't say very erratic Philippines government, a very erratic Philippines president on top of a pretty strong bureaucracy, relatively speaking. The equation changes a bit, and we're going to be moderating our expectations based on this. So on the South China Sea, which is the issue that has really driven a wedge in ASEAN, and one reason why ASEAN is not able to take a strong position, a particularly strong position on the South China Sea, is because it's subject to the opinions of all 10 countries. So 4 ASEAN countries, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei, have a territorial dispute in the South China Sea with China. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand are not interested in having their relationship with China torn apart by supporting their ASEAN friends in an ASEAN context and making these summits all about the South China Sea. Before President Duterte had been elected, you had President Aquino, who who really helped bring the U.S.-Philippines alliance into a new age, increasingly close coordination between Manila and Hanoi on the South China Sea, and there was a reasonably cohesive ASEAN position vis-a-vis China on the South China Sea. Today, all bets are off. So I think what I would like to see out of the summits this summer is Philippines standing up for international law, on which it stands on incredibly solid footing. Because they as ruled by the international bodies. So, the question is going to be whether the Philippines approaches this like a normal ASEAN country, or that has a territorial dispute with China, and realizes that banding together with ASEAN partners is a stronger negotiating tactic than negotiating bilaterally with China. Or whether they approach it like Thailand, or the Philippines, or Thailand or Laos, or Cambodia, who says, I don't want to deal with this issue in this multilateral. So.
Just your previous point, I think Laos and Cambodia are great examples where neither of them really cares about the South China Sea, but Laos has much kind of stronger ASEAN chairmanship here on that, just because they were willing to take a stand, and to the extent that nobody expected Laos to take that stand, it was very positive. Whereas the Philippines, if they use the exact same language as Laos, that will be a disappointment.
Yes.
Based on their situation.
Yes, and people watch these communiques with a lawyer's eye, and perhaps it might even get a little too much attention to this.
Okay.
Jimmy Sumba, I'm in the Senate. Now, in everything that you just said, that different countries have different interests in the group, do you think, or do you see that in the future they will become like a EU type of group, or maybe like the United States could do something like NATO or something like that? Do you think that would be possible?
I don't. In the grand scheme of things, I would say this is the second most cohesive regional grouping in the world, but it's a long ways from the integration in the EU. I think there's interest in breaking down, there's general interest in breaking down barriers to the economic barriers, so forging greater economic cohesion. They basically got rid of tariffs for the most part, although there's an incredible number of non-tariff barriers that prevent increased intra-ASEAN trade. So I think that, but I think there's a lot more progress that can be done on that front. I think there's a lot more progress that can be done on sort of developing an ASEAN identity. But the idea of countries ceding sovereignty to an entity in Jakarta, I think is quite
So I saw you did some work also in Australia with some strategic things like that, and you did work with rebalancing troops to Darwin. I also know that this is a big partnership with the U.S. U.S. is like the biggest foreign investor in Australia. They also helped us with defeating ISIL and Ramadi, different things like that. I'm curious as to your thoughts with China's growing dominance in the area. Do you see Australia having to kind of pick a side when it comes to their diplomatic ties with the U.S., or do you see them shifting over to China, or how do you see that kind of playing out in the future?
absolutely welcome Jeff's thoughts on all this too. But the bigger dynamics that Australia is facing is the same that almost every other country in the region is facing. That China is these countries' biggest economic partner, and the United States is their key security partner, and also the one who they would, in an ideal world, they would like the United States to be setting rules rather than China. But they live in a world where China is an incredibly important partner. Australia, we have no closer friend than Australia. I think that's what I told Leon Panetta he was allowed to say in the speech. We can't say that they're our closest ally because the Japanese get very angry. But we have no closer ally than Australia. I mean, you look across the board, they look at the agenda for U.S.-Australia cooperation. It's like everything that is important to the United States is being talked about in the Australia alliance context. Australia, which is one other point, is there's a lot of discussion about U.S.-China competition in Southeast Asia, and that's real. But it's not just about the United States and China. If you went and asked Southeast Asian countries about how they think about U.S.-China competition or dynamic in their country, they would say, yes, it's there. We wish it was less so. Can't you guys just work on things together when it's practical? But they would also say it's not just about U.S. and China, it's also about Japan as a critical player. Australia is important. We wish India was more involved. They're looking to bring in as many outside partners as possible to create essentially a balance of power. The Indonesians call it a dynamic equilibrium. And they try to wrap us all into process and rules and painful multilateral meetings so that at the end of the day they can retain their strategic autonomy. But I like to think it's not as simple a choice as choosing between U.S. and China for a country like Australia. I mean, if you ask any Southeast Asian country, what do you want in this U.S.-China dynamic? They would say we don't want to choose because we want both of you. I think that the decision for Australia is easier. They really don't have to choose. But there's just no question that this is a dynamic, a new important dynamic that China's economic power does not allow where they necessarily want to be strategically.
We particularly one X factor there where the Australians always harp on this. It's almost a mantra in public speeches now where we don't have to choose between the U.S. and China. And I think that's true to the extent that neither the U.S. or China wants to force the choice. And I think with the U.S. side, we're completely fine with that. Australia having a strong economic relationship with China, secure relationship with us. Sometimes I wonder, what does China think about that? Is China, when it kind of gets into a position where it wants to be primary power in Asia, will it settle for that, or will it kind of force the choice? I think that's a question you kind of hear asked behind closed doors. What is China's intention? And can we continue to navigate this middle ground, or will they going to force our hand at some point?
I would also say, just one thing on footnote on the Australia issue is I think there's a divide between Canberra and the rest of the country on this issue. So if you travel on a staff dial or with my bosses out to Canberra, I actually think Canberra is a little bit out of touch with how the business community is thinking about this issue. I mean, I think everything's a little sunnier for the U.S. Australia than Canberra than it is elsewhere.
Question over there?
Yeah, so you're talking a little bit about how obviously the policy, the countries within ASEAN are craving kind of policy that solidifies stabilize ASEAN as an institution. And we talked about those policies within the ASEAN countries, but can you speak to what they're looking for in terms of policy to develop with countries like the US outside of ASEAN, and how those intersect with the policies between the US and countries like the Philippines and Malaysia versus entities like ASEAN as a whole?
It's a tough question, actually. So, I mean, I think everybody who deals with ASEAN, which is that ASEAN is a more cohesive, higher functioning entity. There have been programs from USAID and other development organizations to build capacity at the ASEAN Secretariat. I think those are useful things to do. But it's actually just as important to build capacity at each of the 10 countries themselves, right? Because if the power is actually back in Manila and in Bangkok rather than at the Secretariat. So I think it has to just go hand in hand.
We think that's the trend now. In the last few ASEAN chairmanships, especially kind of when Alice was chair, there's been a lot of focus not only from the United States and Australia and other key partners, but also more capable Southeast Asians that we're going to help build Alice's capability this year, in part to help them manage the chairmanship, but also it's kind of pay off for them down the road. So I think it's kind of going that direction as opposed to doing it bilaterally on a rotating basis based on ASEAN chairmanship views.
And as far as I'm concerned, helping to support some English language training program, whatever, in Cambodia, for their government, ends up helping U.S.-ASEAN relationship at the end of the line here. Because one of the weaknesses is just the capabilities of their bureaucracies to engage effectively with us. And that's also true on the defense front. So both of us worked in the context of the ADMM Plus, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus. So the ADMM Plus, although the ministers only meet every 2 years, it actually has created this really robust structure underneath with senior official meetings and working groups, and there's a lot in joint exercises among 82 countries. It's pretty robust. But one of the things with just defense diplomacy in Asia generally is you have some defense establishments like the United States who is comfortable engaging internationally. They do international defense diplomacy. Singapore does this, Japan does, Australia does. But the idea of defense diplomacy is pretty new for most of the countries too, right? And so not only do they not have people who think strategically about policy issues in, say, the Ministry of Defense in Burma, they also don't have more than a handful of people who speak English, right? So there's just some very basic things, that elements here that undermine ASEAN right now. Of course, this is all things like that.
Well, sometimes we forget that, and it's very easy to overwhelm these partners. You go in, typical American mindset, like, oh, let's do all these great things, and you realize you're dealing with two people who have very little experience in these issues, and you got to kind of step back and think like baby steps. You got to build capacity.
Thank you.
You said around 2007, 2008, the U.S. refocused or focused for the first time even on ASEAN, but and you talked about how that has changed the relationships since. But what were the factors that led to that change and caused them to focus on it?
So I think, in just the grand scheme of things, of course you can point to various moments when we might have paid attention a bit to Southeast Asia. But I would say there was a lull between 1975, the end of the Vietnam War era, to 2002, October 2002, and the Bali bombing in Indonesia, where Southeast Asia was back on the map strategically here in Washington. I think, unfortunately, in 2002, it was more of a, oh my God, it turns out that Indonesia is the biggest Muslim country in the world, and we might have an Al-Qaeda problem here, and this could be the second front in the war on terrorism. So, attention, as someone who cares about U.S. Attention to Southeast Asia, that was, of course, it's good to have attention, but not necessarily for the right reasons. I think it really was in 2006, 7, 8, you can't really pinpoint this to something like the Bali bombing. It was a sense that China was eating our lunch in Southeast Asia. This was at a time when China was at the height of its charm offensive diplomacy. It really was was. It had ratcheted down tensions on the South China Sea issue in the early and mid 2000s. It was genuinely doing, it was a winner economically for everybody. The concerns about deeper Chinese engagement had not really sunk in for Southeast Asians for the most part at that point. And there was a sense that, I think, here in Washington, that China was eating our lunch. At the same time, of course, Southeast Asian economies were just starting to grow. And we're back from the trough in the 1997-1998 financial crisis. Indonesia had its act together. So it's something we didn't talk about here in terms of ASEAN dynamics. There's a reason why the Secretary of ASEAN is in Jakarta. Indonesia is 45% of the population of ASEAN, it's 45% of the GDP of ASEAN, and it is the natural leader of ASEAN. Indonesia went through an incredibly difficult period politically from about 1997 to 2003-ish. And it was really around 2005, 6, 7, where it really started to sort of get its act together again, and sort of try to reassert its leadership of ASEAN, which I think it's done to. It's a whole other story about the current president of Indonesia. He's more focused on domestic issues and not exactly a global statesman. But at the end of the day, Indonesia is the giant. But the bottom line is China. And as somebody who cares about Southeast Asia, thinks that Southeast Asia is important because Southeast Asia is important, because it has 625 million people and $2.5 trillion economy and the most important waterways in the world and the most fragile ecosystems and you name it. It's just an important place. So it's a mixed blessing that Washington's sort of woken up to it in the sense that a lot of it's because of China. And I think we need to be focused on it because it's important in and of itself. It's going to work with China, but it is true that the China angle makes it all.
Sean, you got one for?
To what extent do you think that separatist elements, such as like the Moro Rebellion and the major rebellion, especially in Indonesia, might affect the ability of ASEAN's ability to project power in the near future? And do you think that these separatist movements might even be successful?
I don't think they'll be successful. I think, in the grand scheme of things, a more federal system in the Philippines is probably where this goes. I'm actually not concerned about separatist activity in Indonesia anymore, although, again, a more federal system for Papua is probably what's needed there. But I think the broader point is that these are complicated developing countries for the most part. Your two high-income countries are Brunei and Singapore. The others are big, complicated places. So when we look at them, and we look at summits, and we look at South China Sea, and all these sorts of things, these are our high strategic goals in mind. But at the end of the day, when Southeast Asian leaders wake up in the morning, they're thinking about the economy, they're thinking about their political survival, they're thinking about some shady bank account. So they're not necessarily thinking about the South China Sea.